Thank you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's actually very interesting to see that what Henry was talking about, I will talk about also, but in a very different way. My task is to define critical factors in the discourse of school leadership, and from the perspective of equity and learning. And many times when you talk about education and education targets, you talk about racing to the top, like Obama is doing for the moment. Earlier in the US, they talked about leave no child behind. And when you look at these kind of discussions, it's all about excellent schools, high performance, and so on. But what really struck me when I was in the US 3 weeks ago, I was at the US Department of Education. And the first 30 minutes they talked about racing to the top. Then the lady who made the presentation was very close to the minister. She started to talk about the children that doesn't make it. And then she became very serious and said, to each of these students that doesn't make it, we build a prison cell. And that became very clear to me that that's one of the big problems in the schools. I mean, you talk about the weak students. A lot of those weak students that doesn't get through education will have no other alternative than crime. I also read a newspaper in Sweden just before I left the US saying that we have about 8% or 9% unemployment, mostly among young people. And then the article said, in 5 years' time from now, we will have lack of people to employ, but we will still have an unemployment of 8 to 10%. And again, it will be the people that are not employable. And I think that's one of these critical factors we have to talk with, and that was just to make a connection to your speech. What I would like to do is also talk about politics. And I would like to say that policy implementation, according to the democratic theory, is that we have a government that have some kind of targets about education, targets about different things, but let's talk about education. And most of those targets are to raise to the top. And they make political decisions. And those decisions, they touch on different implementation structures. And what I have tried to do here is show that there might be another kind of culture. The culture on the top can be blue or red, but now it's blue. And then the culture of the implementation structure might be red. But according to democratic theory, they will understand the blue decision and they will implement it blue. So even if the culture is very different, and you could also think that these kind of implementation structures would be layered. So there might be a green layer, there might be a yellow layer, and there might be a red layer. So there will be very many layers that should understand that blue decision. So in fact, it might be like this, the reality, that you have a target and you have very clear political decision. It hits the local implementation structure, maybe sometimes also the national implementation structures, like national agencies, like in Sweden. And we have a local structure with school boards, municipal councils, and then we have the schools. And the question is, will they understand that the decision is blue, or will they decide that it's red? And what they most of the time do when they doesn't follow the political decision is that they delay it. So sometimes you hear that people are saying that it will take 5 years to implement this decision. And my question is always, why should it take 5 years? If it takes 5 years, little Anders, who is in 7th grade, he will be leaving high school after 5 years. So the change will be there, but it won't happen. And that's the policy some of these people have. Also, sometimes you could say that it's natural to understand that they do it. In Sweden, we have now a new decision from the government saying that we should have very talented teachers could be first teacher. And if you qualify for that, you will have 5,000 Swedish crowns more in salary every month. And of course, a lot of them teachers apply for it, some get it. But then the problems come down to the school, because the school want to use these talented teachers for development work. But there is no money for that. The government doesn't give money for that. They just give money for salary. So if you want to use 25% of that person's time, you have to have a substitute teacher. And that have to be paid by the municipality or by the school. So of course you can understand that the schools are a bit careful. How much will this cost us? Can we afford it? So sometimes decisions, you can look at them and say they are very good, but of course they have problems. But let's go on and try to have the same kind of way of problematizing. This is what I most of the time say, that political intentions are good. There is no, or very few at least, political decisions that say we would like to destroy the education system. They say we would like to improve the education system. And how comes that some decisions are looked at support and others are looked as they were obstructing? And I think that is very much linked to the fact how much do we understand of the political decision. The level of understanding is very central for the way we will look at political decisions. If we have high understanding, the chances are greater that we will view it as support. If the understanding we have of the political decision is low, we will see it as obstruction or control. If you take, in the Swedish case, a decision on quality assurance, when you read the whole text behind the political decision, it's really to help the schools. It's really telling them you should do this and you should talk with your teachers about it, you should involve the parents and students, and you should improve your schooling by systematically following what you are doing in the schools. And of course, the political intention is support. But to get it to support, you need to have a high knowledge of the decision. If you don't understand the intention behind the decision, you will just say, we have to write a quality report and it's just damn control. So I think that's very important, that you have an understanding of the political intentions if you should try to implement it. So people that doesn't really understand the political intention won't see it as support. And there are some decisions that political bodies are taking and have been taking for maybe 40 years. Gender equality is one of these. And what we have all over Europe, girls are performing much better than boys. Is that gender equality? How do we work with that? And all these kind of things that we think about when we talk about gender equality, we see that sometimes it's called abstraction in the schools. They don't want to work hard with trying to introduce modern way of thinking of men and women and their positions. So what it's all about, it's that politics and the profession in the implementation process have different roles. You can talk about the arenas of policy formulation, and that's politics. That's the political level. It's the government, and if you have a regional level, it could be the regional level. It could be also the local level, municipality, council, school boards that make the politics. They make the decision based on political ideas, ideological decisions, but they formulate the policy the majority think should be the best. Then we have arenas of reformulation of policy. In the Swedish case, we have national or central agencies that look at the decisions. They make some kind of practical advice in relation to the central decision or the political decision. And if you look at it, you will find there is a small change in the way it's defined. So that's another critical level of putting decisions through. And of course, then you have the arenas of mediation down at the school level and maybe also local level sometimes, that just try to change the meaning of the decision. But it's a lot of discussions in different ways that change the intention of the policy. And then you come to the function of leaders. And I think or believe strongly that leaders learn all too little. If you have a new policy, new law, decisions from the political arena, you have to learn about it to get knowledge and motivation in relation to the new policy. You have to understand what the meaning is of the new policy. A lot of the time when I talk to people in education, I too often hear that the government is interfering. And they talk about why the government is interfering. We know education, the profession know education, and there is interference. But I believe that leaders have to have sufficient knowledge to be able to communicate policy. We have to be pretty skilled in the way they communicate it. And if they are, I think they also will be able to get new policies through. We did a study just a couple of weeks ago on following 6 of the principals that have been going through the principal training program and asked them how they started development work in the schools. And I was very happy to be able to report that all of them linked their decisions to start to the law or to the new curriculum in Sweden. They read it, they said, here we have the argument, I can talk to teachers, I can talk to parents about it, and I can have some backup. And they were able to implement policies and also implement policies that had been there for many years ago. So if you have high knowledge of a policy, I think the burden of tasks to achieve the policy will be pretty low. But if you think in the model that your knowledge will be down here and you should implement it, of course, the burden of the task will be up here. So that's why I strongly believe that knowledge about the new policy is very, very central for school leaders to have, to be part of the learning process, to be able to learn. If you are, the task of the burden will be less than if you have very low knowledge. So again, talking about school leadership, one critical factor is learning, that you really learn about the policy, you learn about what the task is that you should do. And this is a picture I borrowed from an Englishman, Professor Michael Barber. He did a presentation down in Sydney where he talked about policy and implementation. And his idea is that how you experience and understand the level of change in the policy, challenge in the policy, is very, very important. If the schools think that it's a law challenge in the new policy, and when they look at the quality of the implementation process, they say, we will not spend any extra money, any extra effort on it. You will have status quo, and it won't happen. It won't happen in the organization. If you go back again and say the challenge is slow, but you say, okay, it's important, we will work hard with it. Maybe it will be improved results in relation to the policy. And this is probably where most of the schools end up. And he argues that you need to have understanding that the challenge in the policy might be tough, it might be high. And if you then work little with it, it will be irritation and little change. But if you understands the challenge and you want to work, then you maybe will have a transformation in relation to the new policy. So it's not only having the policy, it's also about how the schools work with the implementation processes and how the state work with the implementation processes. So it's a combination about understanding the policy, learning about the policy, and motivating people to work with the policy. It's very, very important. And in Sweden, going over to more concrete, all who work in Swedish schools should uphold the fundamental values that are set out in the Education Act and this curriculum, and clearly associate, it's misspelling, themselves from anything that conflicts with these values. And that is a very strong statement in the Swedish law, that we have really to look at the fundamental values that are in the Education Act. And we can also say that this is a challenge. We have a new Swedish school law that is just 2 years old. And we also have a curriculum that is new. And we interviewed a principal, and she said the implementation process can be described as building a roundabout in rush traffic. And I think a lot of people understand that. It's very tough to implement this. You have a school, the school should run, and then you have a lot of new things. And you have a study day or two in the beginning of the semester, and then it's business like usual, and you should implement a new law, new policy. So that is also a critical factor. How do you implement it? How do you get time in the organization to work with the new things you have to work with? I then took 2 examples of educational acts, and this is from the Swedish one. And it's talk about equivalent education. Does it mean that education should be the same for everywhere, or that resources of the school are to be allocated equally? Account should be taken of the varying circumstances and needs of pupils. There are also different ways of attaining these goals. So it's a very open way of expressing equity. And they also say, for this reason, education can never be the same for all. And if I have been taking the Finnish document, it would have been looking more or less the same. It would just have said something maybe more precise, but more or less the same. Then I took from the OECD and compared it with Turkey. Improvements have been made, but both quality and equity remains a challenge. Turkey has various priorities to address, including improving equity between. And then it comes. Regions and urban rural areas, addressing the needs of disadvantaged students, preparing quality teachers and school leaders, improving access to and completion of upper secondary school, vocational education and training, tertiary education, strengthening links to the labor market, and adequately defining the education system. It's a long list. So when we talk about equity in this project, it's very different things in very different countries. And some of the old democracies that have been strong social democratic countries like Germany, Sweden, England and so on, Holland, we have solved a lot of these problems. And our problem is the new, maybe multicultural system that is coming into us and the number of immigrants coming in, how do we solve all these problems? And what I started to talk about, how do we get all students to be passing the school years and come out with an exam. That's maybe one of the toughest tasks. And that group in Sweden is about 20%. So it's very tough that about 20% doesn't fulfill what's demanded of them to get a pass in the school system. But we have, I won't go into technique, but it's around 20%. And another way to look at this is then to summarize it. This is the Epsilon discussions, identifying factors. We have been talking about political commitment and priorities. That is very important for the politics saying and what commitments they make to it. I will give an example from the Swedish case again. In the curricula and other documents, it says that we should have greater internationalization of education. But there is no money put to it, especially in the budgets. And of course, people doesn't understand that is, okay, it's good. If we do it, we will have an extra credit, but it's not very, very important. So the commitment from the political level is not that high. Of course, financial resources have a lot to do with this. When we have budget crisis, it's a big problem. When we, like in Sweden, it doesn't really, on the national level we understand it, but we don't understand it on the personal level. We don't have any cuts in our salaries. We will have raise in our salaries by 3% this year, and so on. It's one kind of organization. I'm going from here down to Cyprus to give a speech in a conference with all principals on Cyprus. They have another situation. They told me on the 15th of March this year, we got poor. The salaries have been cut down, and they say they've been cut down by 30%. Of course, it's a totally different situation, a totally different discussion we should have down on Cyprus than we can have in this room. Policy coherence, we talked about that too, that is important. It's the same kind of policy around it. Empowerment of different stakeholders and trust in their professionalism. I think this is also something that is very important. We will get the new PISA results on December 3rd, so it's close. But one difference between, I think, the Finnish system and the rest of us is that the Finnish school teachers have very high status. They have also been left alone, so they have been able to raise their own professionalism. And I think that has been very important for the quality of the schools. But many other countries like Sweden, we have changed the teacher education system 5 times the last 20 years. And of course, it can't be good. Supporting and share disposition to inclusive non-segregated schools. This is becoming a big, big problem in our country. And in many countries, in the Scandinavian countries, we have the right as parents and children to choose schools. We don't have to go to the school closest to us. And this is a good, this is a good thing. The political intention was good, that we should take the school we wanted to go to. But the effects of it is that we have some schools that are very, very good, and they will attract people from the upper social strata, and some schools will be very, very down to the bottom. They will be weak schools. They will be schools that are in danger of being closed down. And this cleavage increase the segregated schools. This is also something that I think is very important. The problem I have with that is that most of the time we researchers, we are proud that we don't want to steal our results. So we wait and we publish the results, and then we hope that the politicians will look at them. But the political problem has been solved by then. So I think researchers need to find another way to discuss their scientific evidence and also present them earlier to the politics if we should be able to influence politics. So not some kind of process around scientific evidence. And of course, in the end, it's all about human resources. So I think that ends my presentation. Thank you.